We are recording. Well, welcome. I'm going to start over. Welcome and good morning to this conversation, Responding in Faith. A rabbi, a pastor, and a priest respond to the current moment. I think we call our current moment the current crisis, the ongoing wildness we're living in, so to speak. This is a follow-up on a conversation we did back in maybe April or May. I can't remember when that was. Feels like 2 years ago. And we're going to just speak on a few questions, taking turns, and then open it up for the group to ask questions and have a general conversation. That's our format. I hope that's okay. So I want to turn, let's do some introductions first. I'm Jarrett Kerbel. I'm the rector at Church of St. Martin in the Fields. Adam, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Adam Zeff. I'm the rabbi at Germantown Jewish Center in Mount Airy.
And I'm John Wilkinson. I apologize if my sound is a little wonky. I'm at the Presbyterian Church of Chestnut Hill, which oddly enough is in Chestnut. And when we did this the first time, I had come maybe 6 months earlier. Now it's that plus whatever time we've been in. So I still feel new to things.
What a wild time to be entering a new calling when you can't even probably meet your congregation in some way.
That's right. That's right.
That's stunning. Yeah. Wow. Well, kind of the kickoff question I was thinking about was simply my religious leader colleagues during this time of pandemic and what I would like to call a racial justice uprising. That's my terminology, but it could be phrased differently. What are you turning to? What is helping you stay connected to God? What's helping you stay connected to sanity? What's helping you stay guided and moving ahead during this challenging time? What sources and our traditions do you turn to? What is especially meaningful to you right now? That's a very big question, so feel free to jump in.
Okay, I will jump. I love jumping. I think one of the things that's been helpful to me is that in our tradition at this time of year, and it's, happenstance, we read from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, all throughout the year, and we read it on a cycle that starts in the fall and then enables us to finish the entire thing within 1 year. So that means that during this period, we've been reading mostly in the book of Numbers, and which is the story of the wanderings of the Israelites. And a lot of the things in there are really good parallels for what we've been going through. There's certainly a bunch of plagues that happen in that book. There are there's a lot of strife between the people. There actually are issues about, if not race, because I'm not sure that race really appears in the Bible, but certainly ethnicity and struggles between different groups. So that's been really helpful to me to be able to look back at that and say, yes, these are struggles that are age old. These are things that, as far back as our traditions go, we've been wrestling with, and there is some wisdom there in from our ancient ancestors that helps us to, if not find the solution, which I don't think they necessarily provides us with the solution, at least know what the questions are and know that we've been dealing with these questions for a very, very long time. So I find that kind of comforting, even though it doesn't magically solve our problems. It does say, oh yes, humanity writ large has been dealing with these issues for a long time, and God willing, we'll still be able to keep struggling with them and finding ways to at least manage in this period as well. And then I'll just say the second thing is that in right now, like that was sort of in the late spring and beginning of the summer. Right now, just last week, we entered this period that in Jewish tradition is known as the 3 weeks. And this is a 3-week period between the date that commemorates the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem in the 2 sieges that was, I don't know, how do you say it? Siege, yes. The Jerusalem was laid siege to twice, once in the time of the Babylonians and once in the time of the Romans. And so there's this date that happened last Thursday that commemorates when the walls were breached. And then 3 weeks after that, there's a date that commemorates the destruction of the temples, the first temple and then the second temple, on more or less the same date. So this time is a time of semi-mourning when we're thinking about moving towards destruction. So that's a difficult time. But it does give us a container for a lot of the feelings of grief and loss and suffering that we've been feeling, to put them into the space of this time. And this year in particular, I've been feeling like, again, even we know from reading other parts of the Bible that even before the destruction of the temples made this period for Jews a very sad period. Even before that, this period was known in the ancient world as being a time of depression and darkness. And there were myths going back before the origins of Israelite religion that talked about why this period of summer in the Near East, where everything looks dead, was a time of suffering and a time of ill fortune. So again, just the idea that even before the origins of our religion, even way back more than 3,000 years ago, there were people seeing suffering in this time, and guess what? They came out of it because we're still here. So that also has given me some comfort and feeling of some ground beneath our feet, because we've managed through really, really difficult times before.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Zeff. So much there to work with. Wow. John, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I appreciate that answer a great deal. I would say, and not just because I think my union requires it, but I think, scripture and prayer, I find myself praying a lot more than ever I have before. And sometimes it's a 30-second prayer, and sometimes it's a more extended one. And mostly it's some personal prayer, help me navigate this day or this moment or whatever, but also for our nation, for our city, for our community. And I think there can be nothing wrong with that. And our traditions, we're a non-liturgical tradition. So I find myself relying actually a lot on the Anglican tradition of daily and prayer, but also scripture in a way that Adam said. And I think the challenge has been not to make our moment fit it, but how does scripture help us understand, navigate our moment? Because I think it's easy to read into, and I think our invitation is to think about the applicability of that moment and that time, or those words, whether it's from Hebrew scripture or the New Testament. And again, in our lectionary cycle, it feels like every Sunday, the lectionary is spot on to the moment in which we find ourselves. And it's like, I don't think that's accidental. I think the other thing that's helping me keep my sanity, as it is reconnecting with lots of people across the whole scope of my life. Whether it's college friends. I now have a college friend regular Zoom chat that never would have existed before this. And now my seminary classmates and I are getting together online every couple of weeks. That never would have existed either. And those gifts, along with the regular family call, our kids are spread out and things like that. So to try to use the technology in a, just in a kind of this kind of way, but also in a more nurturing, personal way. And then trying to find the balance, I think all we're trying to find between, engaging the news enough, but not so much that the news consumes us, but wanting to know what's going on in the world. And also, trying to find a balance of reading and TV, but not too much that you feel like everything and all those other things. I don't know. I hear a lot from people that sleep is really hard. And sleep patterns are really goofed up. So trying to pay attention to all those things. Somebody last week, then I'll stop, said, it's self-care right now is not, don't think of it as a luxury, but think of it kind of as a necessity as we continue to navigate all this. So, and the sanity question is for discussion probably, but that could be true. So.
It's overrated, the sanity.
Yeah.
Really overrated.
Right.
I'll respond to my own question here. I've been really grateful for the tradition of daily prayer and meditation that's part of my life. The immersion every day in the Psalms, especially, I find very helpful, because the voice of the Psalms is so searching and direct, right? The heart of the psalmist just goes right to God, whatever's on it, right? Lament, anger, frustration, self-pity, whatever, boom, there it is. And as someone who comes from a very repressed people, I need aids and help to get myself really out there in front of God, and to trust God with the real guts. And the whole notion of crying out to God has become really potent to me right now, because of the intense feelings of the time, the suffering of the time, which is so on the foreground, and the limited ways to deal with it, right? The constrictions, the frustrations. So life is kind of constricted on one side, but opened up on another. So there are blessings even while we're kind of away from our normal, and wondering what the new normal is going to be, and whether we want to get back to what normal was. And I'll just tell a little story, if I can, about crying out. So my wife is an avid walker, and she takes walks on country roads. And she was on one of her normal routes a few Saturdays ago. I think it was actually July 4th. And she heard the unmistakable sound of a kitten crying out. That little mew they make that's desperate. And Allison, my wife, is a compassionate human being and a cat lover too. So she went on the search for the kitten. And she found the kitten in a hollow tree next to the road. It had found a really good, smart hiding place deep in this tree. But it was only like 8 weeks old. It was a brand new kitten. She was very concerned about it. So she came rushing home, the whole family, because you need 4 people for this rescue mission. We all jumped in the car and ran down to get the kitten. And my job was to put on the long sleeves and the work gloves and to reach into the tree to get the panicked kitten. My son guarded the backside of the tree so the kitten wouldn't run away. So Tim got to stand in the poison ivy. And Allison, my wife, got to give directions. So I reached into the tree, rescued the kitten, and brought it home. And it never left me. It hit me in a really emotional spot, because the crying out, here this lost kitten was crying out with no idea whether the world was benevolent or not outside that tree. That kitten had no idea whether help was coming. No idea who it was crying out to, but it was crying out. And I think on some deep level, I just went to that spot and felt, wow, so much of my prayer life is crying out and feeling somewhat lost and somewhat marooned. And thank goodness, I have a tradition that tells me that my crying out does not go unheard, and that there's a benevolent one who is benevolent out there who will respond, So I identify deeply with the kitten. And I guess in this parable, my wife is God. So the compassionate one who cares enough to mobilize the rescue team. So that meant a lot to me, though. That's kind of where I'm at right now. And I don't know if we want to respond to each other from these stories before we go to the next question. Anything?
What your story made me think of, we were in another program we were studying the very beginning of Psalm 130, which says, right, Mimamakim karaticha Adonai, from the depths I call to you, God. And then it says, Adonai shima b'koli, God, hear my voice, but hear more like listen, or listen attentively, hearken, something like that. to my voice. And we were talking about how even the word for voice is the same in Hebrew as the word for sound. So it's really the sound of the voice that we're asking. In other words, it's not saying, God, listen to my words. I have the right words. They're going to move you to help me. Or listen to my prayer. It's saying, just listen to the sound of me crying out. And just knowing that God is listening, not that God is suddenly necessarily going to reach into the tree and grab us, but knowing that God is listening, that connection might be enough for us to endure whatever we're going through in the depths.
Yeah. I think that word you offered, endurance, is a character trait or a virtue that I've never focused on so much in my life. It's like, how do we teach endurance? How do we encourage endurance? How do we get in relationship to the right resources to endure? Because we're so deeply challenged. And part of the good news for me on that is that that's really, like Rabbi Adam said earlier, that's the story of the Bible. That's pretty much the biblical story right there.
But I was thinking, in my vernacular, that kitten story will preach. So I hope you get to share it with a bigger audience. But also, I mean, the juxtaposition of Psalm 130 in a time where we can't gather to communally cry out, and even when we do, we're wearing masks, so the voices are literally muffled, and we're having this whole debate right now about when we're back together. We probably can't sing because singing is a dangerous act, and our the Psalter is a songbook, and so even the poignancy of juxtaposing that resource with the current moment is really powerful to me. I miss a lot of things. I miss communal singing about as much as I miss anything, and even when we're back together, all the experts are saying that's not a good thing to be able to do for a while. So just the logistics of managing that, but the spiritual loss of that.
Yeah. Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did want to say I love your focus on endurance, and I think that I never wanted to go too broad and say as human beings, but maybe just in our culture, we have a tendency to see problems as things that are overcome, hopefully within 22 minutes on a TV show or something. That there's a problem, there's a character, there's a problem, there's overcoming it, and there's resolution. And we don't stick with there's a problem, and then we have to endure that problem for a very, very long time, maybe for an unknown length of time. And that is really an important thing in our moment when we're in a situation that we have no idea how long it's going to last. We don't know what its twists and turns are going to be. We don't know how or if we can overcome it in some way. So endurance is, I was an endurance runner as a kid, and I still try to be an endurance runner now. And what you learn as an endurance runner is that you're not going to go fast, and it's going to hurt a lot. And the thing, sometimes when people ask me, well, how do you keep running? I mean, how do you run all that distance? And the answer is, you just keep running. And they say, doesn't it hurt? I'm like, yeah, it hurts. And you just keep running. And when your legs tell you, I can't keep running, body, mind, I can't do that, you just keep running. So that's the endurance moment of, even though we feel like our strength fails, we keep putting the feet in front of each other.
That's great. Yeah. I remember that moment in my own running career, which has not been glorious in the least, of realizing, the pain is part of it and it doesn't go away. It's just always going to hurt, which we've been talking about a lot in our Bible studies and morning prayer community here at the church, is just that faithfulness and endurance, and kind of faithfulness, endurance are words that relate to each other, I think. Involves an ability to hang with the pain, to be present to suffering might be another way to put it. I'm very taken by the phrase steadfast faithfulness. I think that's a pretty common combination of words, right? Steadfast love, steadfast faithfulness. That's really speaking to me right now. What is to be learned by staying dedicated, even when it would probably be, it's tempting to think it would be easier not to be, right? I could drift into leisure time or fantasy or whatever solace I get from other places. But this long march, this long durée is a different thing,
When I hear the word endurance, I often couple that with a kind of trendy word, resilience, and have been talking to friends of color over these past few weeks, and they'll say, "Welcome to the party," kind of thing. I mean, it's the long journey of whatever this is going to be, whether it's around the pandemic or quest for racial justice. Our son runs marathons, at least with the marathon, at 26.2, you're going to be done. I think even with this, I'm not sure I'm struggling mostly with the notion of I can plan toward an endpoint, but when there's no endpoint, planning is difficult. So how do you have endurance? How do you have resilience? How can you maintain that steadfastness kind of when you're in the middle of the journey, but you're not even sure you're in the middle of the journey? You may be in the first leg of it. So that's really helpful.
So maybe in some ways we're running a marathon, in other ways we're pushing a boulder up a hill while vultures eat our intestines. Is that the story I'm thinking of from Greek mythology? Sorry, I'm not, Greek's not my religion. So
yeah, I think I was also thinking about, in terms of the struggle for racial justice, there is, especially, for everybody, but in particular for white folks, there's a lot of pain and discomfort in trying to face the racist society in which we live, and from which we benefit in some ways, and it's hard to have the endurance to stay in that kind of painful conversation, right? That's tough, and again, I see the impulse, especially within our community. There's a strong impulse that people, and a valuable impulse that people want to put their energy behind, trying to move towards being an anti-racist community, and at the same time, this feeling of, again, well, this is a problem, so we'll just overcome it. Like, we'll overcome it within months or this year. We'll focus on it and then we'll solve it. And we know that's not how it works. Unfortunately, it would be great if we could do that, but there are certain things that move quickly, and there are certain things, especially, that have to do with the hardest stuff that's inside ourselves, the ways in which we have been, shaped by a racist system to view the world in racist terms. Those things take a really long time, and that work is really difficult. So being able to have the endurance to stick with that, I think, is hard too. And I was thinking about that, earlier in the summer when we had these really large protests, and every day there was some really big protests happening, and I did go to a couple of them. But I was thinking, and people were talking about how long are people going to be committed to this, and is it going to be long enough? Are we going to be committing? Are we going to be raising our voices? Are we going to be doing the work long enough to really make change? Because it does seem like it's kind of like, I don't know what the right metaphor is, but when you're pushing the boulder, you can actually only make a certain amount. You're pushing uphill, so you have to keep going and keep going and keep going. And it seems like it tends to happen at various points in the last, say, 10 years in America, where we have these moments where people are like, yeah, let's get behind that boulder. Let's start pushing, and we push and we push and we push for a couple of weeks. And then we get tired of pushing, and then we go on and do something else, and the boulder rolls back down the hill. So it's just a question of how much endurance do we have to be able to keep pushing it forward.
Thanks, Rabbi. Yeah, I think our African American neighbors know that pattern all too well, right? They know that their white neighbors, us, me, we get connected to these events in the flash moment, and then where do we go? They've had this repeated experience of kind of white companions or white goodwill people of white backgrounds just disappearing on them. And so that's part of this trauma that keeps going forward. And it takes extra discipline and extra devotion to kind of depart from our comfort level and stay committed, stay energized, stay connected. Because this is a very long process. It takes extra resources. It's really kind of a moment when our actual values are unveiled, right? How much do I value my comfort? And how much am I willing to sacrifice my comfort for other goods I value? To put it in a very kind of rationalistic way, right? Am I willing to put aside, I love this phrase, am I willing to de-center myself? Am I willing to de-center my whiteness and put somebody else's good closer to my center? That's a very, in my tradition, that's almost the shorthand for our spiritual journey we're supposed to be on. But at this moment, it's a real question whether you want to choose it or not, right? I mean, how much fraction and how much tension and how much discomfort is that going to take? And some people are coming to the table for the first time and not realizing how deep that learning process is going to be. And are they willing to have the really uncomfortable moments of learning and making mistakes that come with it? It's a long path. I've been doing anti-racism work for 30 years. I'm still stink at it. I'm still constantly tripping over myself, making terrible mistakes, and having to force myself to return to it, right? Because, I'm a pretty privileged white person. I could skid off into a gated community if I wanted to. And I just want to add one more thing to this is we're doing some work at St. Martin's with a really interesting biblical scholar named Vincent Wimbush. He's an African-American scholar. Just off the charts brilliant. But his whole project is about getting the academy and houses of worship to take seriously, and others outside of that, to take seriously the authority of the Black tradition in the Bible, like Black interpretation of the Bible as an authoritative tradition. And one of the things he identifies that's really interesting is that he thinks, from a Black perspective, the scripture is all about trauma. And this goes back to something that Rabbi Zeff said earlier, is that the Bible is a record of people suffering trauma and trying to live through it through their relationship with God. So I think that's something we should really dwell on in this traumatizing time we're living in. Some people, maybe that word trauma sounds too big or too challenging, but there's something when we are overwhelmed by life, whenever we hit the overload of pain and suffering in our souls, we are experiencing trauma to some degree. I don't know if that's fair to say. That might be a risky statement, but what do you guys think? We might open, putting you on the spot there with a big one, but how do you see the Bible as responding to trauma?
Before we gathered, I wrote 3 words on a piece of paper. One was grief, one was novelty, and one was trauma. And I think I'm reading a lot about trauma right now, both kind of individual trauma and communal trauma. And how do we link, we're in many crises right now, but I think there are at least 3. One is the pandemic, one is the economic crises, and one is the kind of racial equity, racial justice. And how do we link those, and how do we engage we engage some of them when we can't engage physically in other ways because of the pandemic, and to be able to acknowledge trauma. I think in many conversations I've had, I don't have a great insight on this, but in many conversations I've had, once the words grief and trauma get out there, it's a gift, because it allows people to kind of acknowledge what's happening, and then you can proceed from there, as opposed to, kind of suck it up, or, just make the best of it, which is kind of our culture, or our, what sports teaches us, or whatever. But to be able to say, yes, we're grieving loss of lots of things. Yes, this is traumatic individually and communally. How are we going to then proceed? So I think that's exactly the right word to get out for us to consider.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much.
I was thinking of, a couple weeks ago, we read the part of the Torah where, in the narrative, where the people, arrive at the edge of the promised land only 2 years after leaving Egypt, and they're ready to go in. And then we have the episode of the spies or the scouts who doubt that they can get into the land. And then God decrees that, there's a plague. And then God decrees that they're going to have 38 more years of wandering before they can go in. So that there's going to be a total of 40. And at the time when we were reading this, I was remarking that the really amazing thing to me is what happens next, which is they go on. They go on. They're like, okay, well, we're not going into the land right now. Let's go off on our journey for the next 38 years. Instead of, you'd imagine they'd be like, okay, that's it. We give up. This is the end of the story. We've had it. But that's clearly a traumatizing moment, and very similar in some ways to what we have gone through in the last few months, in the sense that initially we thought, okay, well, we're shutting down for a couple weeks. Okay, maybe it's a couple months. And then we learned, no, this could be a year. This could be several years. We're on an extended journey, and we don't know what the end of it is. And that's certainly true for the Israelites. In the rabbinic midrash, they talk about how, it said 40 years total, but the people had no idea what 40 years was. They didn't actually have a way of keeping track. So they were like always moving into the unknown, thinking maybe this is the end, or maybe this is not. Maybe we're halfway through. Maybe we have 10 years to go. But they kept going.
Yeah, right.
They kept going. They kept going through the trauma, through the unknown, through all the difficulties they had. They didn't have water, right? There was so much that they lacked, and yet they kept going. So I really relate to that idea that it is a story about trauma, but it is a story also about endurance and about resilience, like John was saying.
Yeah. Wow, that's really great. I love that. I never heard that before about not knowing what a year was, right? That just makes it, 40 sounds like really long, but like maybe read it as 40 means we just don't know. we complete uncertainty about your future. Go. Holy moly, I'm gonna have to sit with that for a bit. That's pretty challenging. I think I was re-traumatized, Adam. So, not to make light of that, sorry. I wanted to add one thing to John's list of 3, as much as I'm fond of lists of 3, because everything in the Episcopal Church happens in 3, because the Trinity, So I would add a 4th thing. So you had the pandemic, the economic crisis, the racial justice uprising. I would add, I'm struggling for the words here, but you guys can help me out. Kind of massive political loss of faith, or massive loss of faith in our politics, something like that. Because I'm not alone in feeling somewhat crushed by the circus of our current politics and how it rubs against things I really believe in. It rubs up against my love of democracy and our constitutional tradition. And, maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm too much of a Boy Scout, but I have persisted in some faith in those things. And to see them so flagrantly abused right now makes me just upset daily. I don't think I'm alone in that. And not to get into like civic religion here, like our highest concern is the good working of our political system, but it does have a strong influence on the goods we share, our common good. And is that ringing any bells with y'all?
Yeah, I really, in the past few months, I keep the phrase I keep coming back to from Harry Potter is the ministry has fallen. when they get the news that the dark forces have taken over the Ministry of Magic, and they get that message, and that's what I said. That's actually what my wife and I said to ourselves when we heard things about different institutions in our, not only in our government, but the CDC, these things that we thought were sort of scientific communities that we can rely on. This we've just seen one by one a lot of those institutions be undermined by forces beyond them that have nothing to do with really their operations, but have to do with politics. And that's a really hard thing, and it's hard. It makes it hard just to try to again pull back from civic religion, but I think it makes it hard for people to believe in anything. When things you trust are undermined, then you start to look at the other things you trust and say, well, can I really safely trust in those things? Can I really safely trust in religious institutions? Can I really safely trust in God? When so much of my trust apparently has been misplaced in institutions. So that's a really difficult thing to go through, and I do think it belongs on that same list because it makes it harder for the future, and I think it does make it hard just thinking about for younger people. Especially people who are in that stage, and several of my kids are in this stage between, education and full establishment in a career. There is that state of sort of searching and trying to figure out what do I do? What can I rely on? What do I connect to? And that's always a difficult stage of life. But I think our current situation makes that stage of life even more difficult when so many of the things that people, kids have been told, the building blocks, the structures on which they're going to build their lives, internships, connections, networking, all these kinds of things don't really exist. Like they've all been pulled out from under their feet. Now what? And I know from talking to college students that for many of them, what's happening for them with their, colleges are making different decisions about what is the fall going to be like. Are there going to be in-person classes? Are there going to be people in dorms? And is college life going to be anything like it was before? That raises for them the question of, is that worthwhile to do? Actually, is this what I should be doing with my life? That path that I thought was the path for me of like graduating from high school and going to college and getting a job, maybe that's not the right path. Maybe I shouldn't be trusting in people who are telling me do that path. Maybe I should be doing something else. And depending on what those kids' other experience has been, or those young adults, that might be the first time they're suddenly thinking, whoa, the trajectory of my life might not be what I thought it was going to be. And I might need to take a turn and really rebuild my sense of who I am and what the path forward is.
Where there's loss, there can be freedom and new gifts, right? There's still loss and grief, but there's also a new gift, right? Yeah. Thanks so much. John, do you want to weigh in on this one at all?
No, I think I'm trying to find, and maybe we can post it. David Brooks wrote about this, and he actually has 5 crises, and I can't remember what they all are. But one is his wish for, and it's not a partisan piece, but a fully functioning 2-party system, so that we have the kind of give and take that we've known over our time. So I think we're institutional people, and every institution feels like it's up for grabs right now, educationally and religiously and civically. And I'm a sports fan. I miss my sports even, and those whoever would have thought that there wouldn't be seasons. to be people playing games right now, and even that's out. And then the question in my daily prayers are, oh God, give me enough kind of capacity to try to figure out what's going on and make a useful contribution. And other times it's who knows how all this is going to resort and land again. Adam, I think your point about higher education is really spot on. And not just the logistics of what does going back to school in the fall look like, but what's the point of higher education when the world feels like it's, one quick story. I follow the WNBA a little bit. So one of their star players, Maya Moore, who decided, I'm going to not play this year, not because of the COVID, but because there's a man incarcerated who I think has been wrongly incarcerated, and I'm going to dedicate my energy to getting him out of prison. And she succeeded. But I go, what a story. So she literally sacrificed lots and lots of money to be able to get this job done. And I think that those are the questions all of us should be asking all the time anyway, about meaning and how we're stewards of our time and our gifts. But I think that younger generation especially is asking those, and how can we support them in asking those questions and also getting out of the way of what older institutional answers might be. So I think it's yes to that question.
Wow, thanks, John. You said two things in a row there that I want to put together, which is this younger generation is showing us some really important things that we can learn. They have been really terrific, well morally oriented people right now. That they've got a moral sophistication and language that's pretty impressive. People try to dismiss it and write it off and say, oh, they're too much, they're politically correct, whatever. I disagree. I think they're pretty finely tuned in, and I want to listen and learn. And I think they're going to rush right past some of us institutionalists, frankly. That's another thing, is for those of us, like I think the three of us represent institutions, and I know I care deeply about institutions, many kinds, but we really have a challenge in front of us to keep teaching the next generation why institutions matter and why they align actually with their aspirations, their highest aspirations, right? And why we're part of that progress for them. It's a really skin of the teeth moment for me that way. It's like, are we gonna stand out well enough and be perceived as on the right side of these things? I mean, the example I keep giving is the two young college women who ran that great march in Mount Airy. They ran it before any of us clergy got to it. And we jumped on the bandwagon that they started. And I give them a lot of praise for that. And so institutions are at play here and definitely at risk in our world.
I definitely feel that the institutions are, I think one of the problems of being an institution that has a building, as I think we three do, there's all sorts of practical problems about having a building. But the other thing is that it makes people see the institution as if it's the building, and thus makes it seem sort of static, solid, set, literally in our case in concrete, and as if it's not changing all the time. And from the inside, we see it changing all the time, but from the outside, it can always just look like an unchanging wall that is just there, is never going to change, is never going to respond. And so it's trying to make it a little more transparent how institutions, in fact, do respond all the time. And the image I'm having is it's kind of like Penelope doing her weaving and then unweaving it all the time. I feel like that's actually what institutions do, is they're constantly trying to weave things together that are getting unwoven all the time, every day. We weave together and then it gets unwoven, and we weave it together differently and then it gets unwoven, and we use different threads and there's different people doing the weaving. That's what institutions are. And so ideally, institutions are set up well to respond to the feelings of the people who connect to them. But we see a lot of times institutions end up with their own momentum stopping them from doing that. And I think, we've had a little bit of controversy in our community just about the words Black Lives Matter, which seem like, on the one hand, extremely easy words to say, because who could disagree with those words? And yet, because there's been confusion amongst institutions, especially in the Jewish world, about what else might be implied by saying that, what organizations might be thought to be being supported if you said Black Lives Matter, a lot of Jewish institutions have actually been reluctant to say those words. And so you saw lots and lots of statements after George Floyd's murder of Jewish institutions writing and using lots and lots of words other than those words. Because even though lots of members of the Jewish institutions, right, the people, in fact, were out in the streets saying those words, chanting those words, putting those words on signs. So it's painful. And it was painful in our institution to go through it. We went through it. We did put up a sign. This is Black Lives Matter in front of our synagogue. Not everybody agreed, but most people did. But to me, that's a thing about change, because 4 years ago, when people wanted to put up a sign, Black Lives Matter, there was much less support in the synagogue. And that was exactly at the time when a bunch of organizations who were connected to that slogan got together and put out a platform, and the platform said things about Israel, and so a lot of Jewish communities got very upset about that. Things change. So that's an example of institutions actually being able to respond to the people and being able to say, yeah, things have changed now. And now we see that this is more important than that. This step is more important than that fear. But that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing for institutions to do that. And of course, part of the value of institutions is they don't change quickly, is that they connect to the past, that they have some institutional memory. That's what we want from institutions. And I think it's not just like, sometimes I feel like we like to put all anti-institutionalism on the young, which I don't like doing, simply because I feel like we live in a kind of anti-institutionalist culture. Americans are set up, they're primed to distrust institutions. And American history is often taught as being an anti-institutional movement, that let's reject a king. That's what America is really about. So it's not only about the young, it's about living in a culture that is in some ways hostile to institutional memory, and trying to figure out how do we balance the value of being an institution with the necessity of responding to change.
Thank you so much. Let's open it up for questions using our last time together for questions and answers. Please unmute yourself and direct a question to all three of us or any one of us. So go right ahead. Do I hear a question? Oh, we silence them. That's what good clergy do. We just shut them down.
It's the awe.
You were talking about institutions and the challenge in the modern age of what to do. It's been a tradition, I think, in most religious institutions to avoid being overtly political. And from the cynical point of view, that has to do with institutions and their leaders not wanting to alienate some of their followers and their gifts to the institution, but also the feeling that the mission of the religious institution is larger than saying, I favor this bill in the state legislature, or I don't like this candidate as much as I like that candidate running for governor, whatever it is. But maybe, just going back to the list of the key words for the day, maybe the fourth one that Jarrett mentioned about religion and its place and its function and the failing relevance of it and so on does have to do with whether the leadership of the religious institutions is going to directly address some of the issues that are political in one sense, but go much deeper than just being political questions in another sense. I think, for instance, saw a little clip on a news show last night about a new book just written about the separation of the immigrant families, and with our short memories, it's like, oh yeah, I remember that problem, as though it's gone away, when in fact, for many of those families, it hasn't gone away. So if those kind of things can't be addressed because they're too political, then the church or the synagogue or the temple, whatever it is, fails to really address the issues that are not merely just political, but are deeply ethical and at root religious. Who are our neighbors, and how do we care for each other, and what are the great commandments, and how do we live them out? They're really religious questions, but they also look like political questions, and therefore I think the religious institutions dodge them a lot. How not to do that without alienating people is, I guess, what I'm throwing out there.
That's the $100 million question right there. That's a good one. I have felt at St. Martin's, we've been preparing for this for a long time in a slow, gradual process of becoming more politically engaged. And I define politically engaged as concerned about how we responsibly use our power as a community to shape common good, right? How do we take our part in responsibility for shaping our common life together? Not partisan politics, but just the politics of being a community. And we've taken more risks this time out by putting ourselves more out there, like Germantown Jewish Center. There's a Black Lives Matter sign on our lawn. Not everybody loves that. There's a refugees welcome here sign. Not everybody loves that. And my basic conviction has always been that, I will do my darndest as a pastor to love everybody while putting the real challenges in front of them. The challenges that faithfulness calls us to confront, evil, to confront death dealing, to confront injustice. And my love is limited, right? I can only do so much, right? It's something I try to develop and nurture, but it's not the answer to every darn question, that's for sure. So we do lose people. When you do take a stand, some people choose not to associate. And that's just the fragmentary nation of our voluntary structures, right?
We've been, this is a longstanding debate within Jewish communities. I think it's gotten more intense in the last 10, 20 years, simply because Jews have been in a more stable place and felt like they could have that conversation. 50 years ago, people did not feel like they could have that conversation about raising communal voices about issues of general concern. And in our community, we had a conversation over the last year and a half about whether the community could ever or should ever take stands as a community on issues of social concern. And there we did parlor meetings, we did surveys, and of course there was a lot of disagreement. Certainly there were people who felt like, this is not why I go to my synagogue. I turn to my synagogue for, religion, and it shouldn't be saying things about what I might see as political issues. Other people were worried that although they might support that, they felt like maybe the synagogue would just be so embroiled in that it'll take all our energy. And then, of course, there were people who said, if the synagogue is not doing that, what is it? what is the point of religion if religion does not say anything about what we should be doing in our social lives together, how we should be acting? What is the point? And that's something that I've been teaching about for years. Is like, it's wonderful to study Torah, but if we're studying Torah and that's not having an effect on what we do outside of the synagogue, what was the point? That was not what the ancient rabbis had in mind. I think they have a long debate themselves about what is the point of studying Torah, and their whole point is the point of studying the Bible is to get you to act. So if you study and you don't act, forget about it. If you act and you don't study, then you're just acting randomly. You have to study and then you have to act. So that's what we've been trying to do. And we've only had this, we had then passed a new policy allowing us to, as a synagogue, take positions on issues. And since we've put that policy in place, I think there have been 4 decisions on 4 different issues that we took a stand on. And the latest one was this Black Lives Matter sign. So it's interesting, and it's always balancing. Certainly we're going to lose people, but we did have really, especially in the survey results, I remember we had a number of people who said, if the synagogue does this, then I'm going to quit. And then we had an equal number of people saying, if the synagogue does not do this, I'm going to quit. So, you lose people on both sides, but you also gain people on both sides, and most people, God willing, are in the middle.
I think people know that institutions are at risk, so threatening to quit is a power move. It's a power move. It's conscience, but it's also a power move. John, anything on this one?
No. And then I'll keep talking after I say no. I think both of you have said some really wise things, and I think it's helpful to distinguish partisan versus political, and capital P political versus lowercase p political. And I'm enough of a church historian to know that different traditions, depending on their histories, have engaged this question in different ways, depending on their place in the world and the places from which they came. I just, paying attention a lot to the church history recently, my stream of white Christianity made slavery and racism worse in the South. So the posture of doing nothing by saying there's this impenetrable wall between what happens in the church and what goes on in the world actually made the world a lot worse because of that stance. So I think, so a couple things. One is whatever you do needs to be, speak the truth in love, and also act out the truth in a communal setting. So if you're in relationship within your community, so our members know each other and go through a process, I think that allows disagreement to happen in a different way based on relationships than if it doesn't. And so that's important. And whether that's a pastoral relationship or relationship with members. And at the same time, what I often say is, again, to Bob's point, Bob Plus, I'm not going to say vote this way on this bill or vote for this candidate. Number one, that goofs up our tax status. But number two, we have a long standing kind of creedal affirmation. God alone is Lord of the conscience. So it's not my job to tell people what to believe. It is my job to say, okay, here's what I think the prophet Amos is saying, or here's what I think the book of Revelation is saying, and take that teaching and internalize it, and then it needs to lead to some kind of action. If not, then it just kind of becomes a circular conversation. So alienation, you hope you can avoid. Messiness you can't avoid, because these are all messy realities we find ourselves in. And I'll add with one thing. I had a rabbi friend on the North Shore of Chicago who said, however you have these conversations, here's another set of 3, Jarrett, so you can write this down. However you engage in these conversations, do it with clarity, humility, and integrity. And if you can be clear about what you're talking about, so that we're talking about sides a lot these days, I just want to make sure I understand what that means before you then go a step further. And then the other 2 things, you hold on to stuff you hold it lightly. You hold it with integrity, but you hold it lightly. And then you trust, in our language, you trust the Spirit, you trust God, you trust the power of the community to kind of let it happen. And you hope alienation doesn't happen even in the face of even hard disagreement, but you hope you can kind of have some kind of reconciliation. So having nothing to say, that's what I've got to say.
You're like a living Zen koan over there.
Yeah, exactly.
Saying of not saying. That's the Presbyterian koan. The any other questions out there?
Yeah, I have a comment and a question for the rabbi, I guess. A few weeks ago, the businesses in Chestnut Hill were boarded up for a while. And once they were boarded up, they started painting things on them, like Black Lives Matter, or this is a local business, all things to try to deter who would ever try to break into those places, that this is not the one to choose. So when you put a sign out in front of your synagogue in Germantown, Black Lives Matter, you raise the issue of, well, what happens to all those people who say all lives matter? And I know that's a political hotspot right now, but you do have that issue. Why is it there, and what is its real function? Are you trying to say something? Are you going to do something afterwards? What's it there for?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the concerns, one of the many concerns that our executive committee, which is the one charged with making these decisions, talked about was the idea that if we put up that sign, some people would say, oh, well, you just put up a sign. That doesn't actually mean that you're addressing racism. You just thought that's the easy way out. We'll put up this sign. So one of the things we tried to communicate, and continue to try to communicate to people, is that we have no illusions that putting up that sign is the be all and end all of what we need to do to address racism, nor is it the be all and end all of what we need to do to identify in a particular way with becoming an anti-racist community. It actually became for us in part, what would it mean not to put up the sign? What would it mean not to make that decision? And although we knew that there were all these different dangers, certainly there were people who wouldn't have wanted and did not want us to put up the sign. There were people who wanted it, and there were people who were concerned about what message it was sending about our actual commitment to addressing racism. That it was sort of on balance, it's better to do it than to not do it, which I think is a lot of how these decisions really get made. It's, a wise person who used to be a member of our congregation, Paul Wolpe, who's an ethicist, said that, there are no easy ethical decisions. There's only real ethical decisions are ones where it's really hard to choose between this way and this way, because if it was obvious, it wouldn't be a dilemma. So we know that it's always difficult to wade into these waters, and we also were aware that each time we make a decision to, yes, using our traditions and our backgrounds and our beliefs to address an issue of public concern, every time we do that, we shape the next time, because people are going to say, well, why did you do it for that issue but not for this issue? Maybe isn't this issue as important as that issue? So it's always wading into a morass. But I think, on the whole, we thought we had more to gain than to lose by going in and doing this very messy thing. It would be a lot cleaner and a lot easier to stay out. And certainly many Jewish communities have made that decision, and I respect that, because it can be very, very difficult. Other communities, I would say, have gone a direction we would never go, to the point of, yes, endorsing candidates, taking very active positions on particular pieces of legislation. Those are things that I certainly, and I think the leadership of our community, are holding people back on, because we feel like that's outside our purview, truthfully. And I feel like it's often out of my purview as a rabbi. I'm not an expert on public policy, and I'm not an expert on which legislation is right. My expertise is Torah, my expertise is Jewish tradition, and Jewish tradition does speak to particular moral values that need to be upheld. And the easiest thing, I often quote our colleague, Reverend Ernie Flores, who years ago came to our sanctuary and was asked this question about politics. And what do you do, Reverend, when the people say to you, you're just supporting this party? And he said, well, I tell them I'm not supporting the Republican Party, and I'm not supporting the Democratic Party. I'm supporting the party of Jesus. And I said, Pastor, I just need a different formulation of that for me. I just that one particularly isn't going to work for me. But it's not about parties. It's about, there's moral value here that we put forward. And I'll the very short example is about feeding the hungry. We have a national program for feeding the hungry called SNAP, and there's been a bipartisan attempts over the last 10 years, 20 years to cut it and to feed fewer people. And that's something that's so deeply embedded in Jewish tradition and in the Bible. The idea of feeding the hungry is God's work. And so I feel really comfortable to advocate for that. And it is one of those lovely situations where neither political party is getting it right. So we're very clearly expressing a moral value.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi. I think we have about 6 more minutes. Let's hear another question. One of the reasons we have a Black Lives Matter sign from the church is, well, we've done 7 years of intensive anti-racism work at the church, so I wouldn't feel comfortable putting it out unless we were congruent with the message. Also, it invites conversations and chances to educate, right? I mean, so someone will say, why not all lives matter? And well, there's a chance to have a really good conversation, right? And that can open up into a real teaching opportunity. Well, someday I hope to have that sign up, but right now Black lives are more threatened and devalued than all other lives. So we're gonna do this as a corrective for now. That's what I say. Conversation can go from there in a lot of directions. Also, the Black Lives Matter sign is the thing you see right before you see the sign for the Philadelphia Cricket Club, which has a pretty racially insensitive logo on it of a Native American person appropriated to be a symbol of a club that wouldn't accept people of color when the logo was adopted. So, and we've engaged the club as our neighbor in that conversation. And what's interesting is I had a dialogue with one of my vestry members about why should the church have anything to say about what a neighbor does? And I mean, that's a pretty fundamental ethical question. I mean, she brought it down to the most basic question. Why do we care what a neighbor does? And do we have any say in what a neighbor does? And I think this is a younger vestry member. She's actually a high school member. And, I think in her mind, maybe sharing a strong opinion is oppressing somebody, or maybe disagreeing is dangerous for relationship. All these things come into a factor. And I kind of think disagreeing and sharing our opinion with a neighbor is a way of challenging them into their better self, right? And also challenging us into a better neighborhood. I'm very aware of people of color who walk down that street all the time and have to see that sign, right? I'm very aware of how Native people feel about being used that way. We have a strong relationship with a number of reservations through the church. So, we are in solidarity and want to speak up for people who have very little power to speak up, actually. I'm hoping the decision about the Washington football team is going to help our cause. So, we seem to be swinging in a certain direction here. So, other questions?
That would be the logo on the Washington Redskins that was designed by an Indian?
Yeah, by a football team that opposed integration.
No question about it.
Yeah.
It's like a politically correct argument, the logical extension of which is we should be tearing down the Washington Monument because he was a slave owner.
Well, we're in these trying times where we're discerning these things, right? Where we're, like, our church doesn't have our history on our website right now because we're not sure how to tell it, right? We have to retell our church history with new facts and factors in it, because we can't just tell a rosy story that doesn't include the racism of the neighborhood, the racism of the church. We are in a new place. We got to tell a wider truth. And monuments are particularly difficult because monuments are kind of mute in a certain way, right? Monuments don't tell a whole story. They they're not even history. They're just, right? They're just kind of a statement,
Or a talking point.
Or a talking point, right.
Nothing wrong with that, but you've just stumbled upon why it's so difficult for a church or a synagogue to deal with political issues, even of this type.
Well, tell me more. Yeah.
Well, because you offend people when you talk about trying to regrade the past, about how prejudices were back then and how it should affect us now.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it?
You're held responsible for the fact that Thomas Jefferson couldn't keep away from his slaves. I mean, that shouldn't be something that should be an issue for us now. It doesn't change what he did.
Yeah. Well, it's an issue for African American communities that it was hidden for so long. The guy who taught my father-in-law medicine is the guy who discovered that genetic connection, and that wasn't too long ago. And it was amazing, the response to it. You know, and I think, let me tell you one creative story about this. A young member of my congregation did an amazing art project when she was in college. She made a silhouette cutout, life size, whatever that means, of Sally Hemings. And she brought it and she put it on the steps of the Jefferson Memorial in DC. And she stood next to it and just observed what happened all day and engaged people in conversation around it. So she corrected history by bringing Sally Hemings into the monument. And it was creative and non-destructive, right? Nothing was destroyed, nothing was changed, right? I just thought it was an amazingly corrective and creative response to balancing out the silencing and erasing of certain history, which is what we're trying to reverse right now. That's a neat example. Yeah.
Following up on that, there was an NPR interview this morning with a ninth descendant of Jefferson, who is from Sally Hemings' line, and raising the question of the concern about the words that are carved on the walls in the monument surrounding the statue of Jefferson. The words are clearly about all men created equal, and this will happen sometime and should be done. And yet, in his own life, he did not free any slaves and profited from their labor. And there's a pretty moving way to think about it. And the suggestion of, could they bring other images into the monument without desecrating that monument to Jefferson, but bringing it up to what we really know. So it's a concern.
I'm a big fan of the more speech approach, which is add interpretive materials, like turn a mute monument into history, right? You know,
Sure.
If you put a plaque next to that that says, well, when all men were created equal is written, it didn't mean really all men, and it certainly didn't mean all women. You know, it's that expands the context, right?
And that's a talking point for the context too. I mean, there was more in the Declaration of Independence dealing with slavery than what ended up in the final draft. They had to remove that because of the objections of the Southern colonies. So the issue was there even then.
Yeah.
But I mean, you can't take that part out of the history of Jefferson either. He had that in there.
Right. Fair enough. And I was pointed out to me recently by a friend on the Rosebud Reservation that our Declaration of Independence refers to Native Americans as immoral savages. You know, it's in our founding documents. I mean, it's deep. And Pennsylvanians we like to take ourselves off the hook because of William Penn, but it's not really that rosy of a history here either. So yeah. I'm dominating right now. I should back off. I
think it's even merciless savages. It's
merciless. Merciless. Sorry, which is pretty wrong. Yeah.
When the pandemic is done, I'll buy Jarrett and Harry a beer, and they can continue this conversation. But one of the things
I would love it. That'd be great.
One of the things I have been thinking about a great deal, and I think the monument question and renaming everything. I mean, I think some are obvious, some are more nuanced, and I wish we had more of a kind of civic capacity to have these conversations. But one of the issues is, how well do we know our history, and how do we, you know, I think many of us probably watched Hamilton on July 3rd, the night it came out or whatever. You know, who lives, who dies, who tells the story. About this is really a question about how the story gets told, and I I think it's not about erasing history, but it's about broadening and deepening and interpreting history. I wish we had a better capacity to do that. I think we would all be well served civically to be able to do that. But right now, things like football team names and other things feel like some of that's low-hanging fruit. Some of it's the best we can do right now, and we need to do more, but at least we're doing some of those things right now.
Right. Fair enough.
So I think the Northwest Faith Institutions of Philadelphia should put together interfaith seminar, include all the different institutions on the statues of Philadelphia.
Oh, wow. Heyo. Boy, that'll be
Hundreds and hundreds of them. And for the most part, we don't know where they are, who they are, or why they're there.
Until very recently, none of them were African American.
Right.
When they put up the Octavius Cato statue, that was the first African American statue in the city of Philadelphia, and that was 3 years ago. So that's
not quite right.
Is it?
There's a monument to the colored soldiers and sailors, and it's in Logan Square, and it has moved. I'm not sure if it's moved more than once, but I know that it moved in, I don't know, 20 or 30, maybe probably 30 years ago. It was put in Logan Square, and it had been sort of in a remote part of West Park.
Oh, okay. Maybe what I heard was this is the first statue to an individual. So yeah. All right.
I just want to put in a plug for it. As important as public monuments and names of sports teams are, for us looking into the histories of our own communities and our own even our own families, because I think that also it's not about in some ways I feel like it's not about the struggle of like who gets to tell the story. It's about how do we understand ourselves. And we understand ourselves differently if we have a broader view of what our history is. And I think of that for Germantown Jewish Center. We often tell our story in a relatively narrow way about Jews moving to Northwest Philadelphia and not, wanting to have a place to educate their children. And so starting the synagogue, and then, it built a building, and then it got involved in various kinds of civic affairs and going forward. And it doesn't, when I tell that story, I usually tell it in a slightly broader context of, why did Jews move to Northwest Philadelphia? It was because they thought they could move to a place that they were not allowed to move earlier, because in fact it was Germantown, a place where Germans lived and where Jews were not welcome. And then at a certain point, Germans started moving out of Germantown, and that allowed Jews to move in. And that same dynamic, only a couple decades later, allowed African Americans to start moving into Northwest Philadelphia, into Germantown, at a time when previously they would not have been able to move there. So that's part of the dynamic of our history, and the fact that people, members of Germantown Jewish Center, got very involved in issues of housing discrimination against African Americans was because they'd recently had exactly that same experience, and there was a connection there that people saw, and the fact that then decades later, when pretty much every Jewish institution in Northwest Philadelphia was moving to the suburbs, that the board of Germantown Jewish Center decided to stay. That was made possible because of the connections that people had built through that activism, which had been motivated by their previous history. So it's a really complex story, and it also, of course, does not get us off the hook, because what happened after that, of course, was that living in a neighborhood as we do, where there is a rough kind of parity between African Americans and white folks, we did not open ourselves up to the idea that actually a sizable number of those African American folks were in fact Jewish, but were not coming to our synagogue because they felt that the synagogue was a white institution that was not welcoming to them. And that's changed a little tiny bit, so that we do have some of those Black Jews who are members of our synagogue, and that's a wonderful thing. But we still have so much more work to do to open ourselves up even further and to understand ourselves differently. And I think the understanding our history differently helps us to understand ourselves in the present differently, in ways that can actually change our actions, change who we are as an institution, and change who we are as individuals.
Thank you, Adam. Part of what started this kind of conversation, this, is it a series now that we've done 2 of them? What started this series was Adam, John, and I sitting down and thinking about how do we build relationships, Christian-Jewish relationships in the Northwest, because another part of our history here is division all across that axis too, right? An anti-Semitic history to the Chestnut Hill neighborhood where Jews really weren't allowed to live here. There was a line drawn, and it was policed, and that went for the neighborhood and the institutions, Chestnut Hill Academies, Springside School, Philadelphia Cricket Club did not allow Jewish members until the late 80s. The club, not until late 80s, the schools earlier. So in the churches participated that either through silence or tacit consent, or not challenging the powers that be in the neighborhood about it. So we have a mission locally here to do some relationship building and some repair around that historic anti-Semitism, frankly, just to put it right out there rawly. It's real, and we don't benefit the neighborhood by not saying what's true. But we benefit the neighborhood by telling the truth and then living into something better. And I'm super grateful to John and Adam and just all of the ways we're finding ways to build relationship, to model respect, model learning from each other. I've just learned so much. Adam and I were part of a Bible study for years, and I will, for the rest of my life, be grateful for that Bible study and realizing how often I was getting the Hebrew Bible wrong. So many times I read a word and Adam would say, but in Hebrew that means, I'm like, oh, you're kidding me. I've been preaching that wrong for 25 years. All right, well, we probably should wrap up. My brain hurts after a certain amount of time on Zoom. I don't know about you. Any benedictions, any last words?
Just a word of gratitude to everybody on the call and for just engaging.
Yeah, thank you for engaging. It's really, I did a column for my congregation this week that basically said we need each other. We cannot understand or perceive what's going on with the world or with God without each other's eyes and hearts and feelings, because it's just too much for us as an individual to take in and understand. We really do need to understand through community, through tradition, through multiple voices, through multiple perspectives. And by doing that, we can start to approximate a knowledge of what's going on. And even more important, like Rabbi Zeff said, learn to take action together in a meaningful way that is more caring than hurtful. So maybe that's a way to end. How's that? Is that maybe we're part of that exercise here. So thank you all very much. Thanks for participating. I'm very grateful. Peace to you all. Have a great day on this beautiful summer day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How do I turn it off?
I'll turn it off for you. How about that? There you go. I'll send you guys the recording.